Back at my desk, I use a magnifying lens and a loupe and a magnifying visor to understand my subject. In this photo, I am performing a ball moss frond removal, a little bit of surgery, under the magnifying lens because the ball moss leaves were twice the size of the specimen and obscuring my view of the lichens. I take reference photos with my phone and my macro photography apps. These are photos that I took down the stereo microscope lens. They help me pinpoint specific characteristics as well as the depth and layers of different lichen types and species. So in this instance, I'm noting that this Teloschistes does not have cilia, and over here, this one does. In the Cladonia, I've got a closer view of this fruiting body, and then I also need to know what's happening behind it. On to the dividers. So as an architect, now that I have a specimen in hand of lichen that I need to possibly scale up, I must draw it and potentially magnify it. And these are my proportional dividers. I've seen other artists have them in this talk series. They're fantastic. They're my most important tool. At the bottom left of this drawing is an acorn cap. And if I wanted to scale it up 5 times, I would slide the marker, this marker here, using the screw on the front leg to the number 5, and that is the number 5, and then hold the compass points at the small end of the X to the width of the acorn. And then the large end of the X would automatically give me 5 times the width of that acorn cap. Awesome. Huge savings of time. These are always on my desk. You can spot the divider in these photos and all through the rest of the presentation, pretty much. So as an architect, I'm facile with reductive scale, making things smaller, but it was a revelation to use magnified scale to see and to draw what I felt was missing during my lichens on a twig 1-to-1 phase. So when choosing a final scale, I consider the dimensions of the actual size specimen, what I intend to focus on in the painting, and how large it will need to be for me to convey the lichen's characteristics through my medium. On the far left is an annotated reference photo of the lichen grouping. At this stage, I had hypotheses about the species associated with each letter. In the first step, I drew the lichen group right here at actual size. And then I laid a grid over the top of that, it happens to be in centimeters, recording the greatest height and width dimensions. When using proportions, it doesn't matter whether you use imperial or metric measures until you have to lay out the drawing on final paper. In the center, I drew the grid 3 times larger and then followed by moving square to square and filling in the rest of the lichen. On the right, I drew a final grid twice that size again and filled it in. Final drawing is 6 times the original. And as I tell my students, you're essentially making a botanical dot to dot. So on top of the technical grid drawing that we just saw, I overlay tracing paper and make a more expressive drawing that retains dimensional accuracy while combining all of the information I've accumulated: species characteristics, directionality, shadows, voids, textures, and I use line weight to inform me about edges and depth. Some of this is scribbled in a strange shorthand, but I'm the only one who needs to understand it, so that's fine. I call this a botanical cartoon or blueprint. The more of these that I make, the more they resemble topographic maps. I don't transfer all of my data onto my final paper. That's a mistake that I have made in the past and learned from, but it's a handy reference because it's packed with instructions and data. It's always beside me when I'm working on my rendering. On the right is the final painting of gimlet-eyed, scaled up 6 times, in colored pencil with watercolor tea wash and dry brush details. This was my first lichen piece, and I had to figure out, as I was painting, how to deal with the continuation of the twig into the background, and I chose to fade it out to an extreme. Gimlet-eyed was named for the bit of live oak twig that appears to be piercing through this lichen cluster, looks like a log here or like a branch, but it's actually a tiny little twig.